Canada has several oil and gas pipelines, but we wanted to give everybody a sense of where our major crude oil pipelines are. So we had this map drawn up. Enbridge Line 5 starts in Wisconsin. It runs through to Michigan to southern Ontario. And then there's the Trans Mountain Pipeline. A lot of people remember that from the news. That starts in Edmonton and ends in Sudbury, BC. So how feasible would it be to build an east-west pipeline across this country? I mean, really, we span 6 time zones.
Well, it's important to first break down what exactly we mean when we say an east-west pipeline. And in my mind, this can either mean, first of all, a devoted Canadian pipeline meant to act as exclusively a redundant route to solidify security of oil supply in Ontario. And this would imply a 500 to 600,000 barrel per day pipeline that goes along the route of the, approximately the route of the Trans-Canada gas pipeline that currently exists. The second idea would be a larger, likely 1 million plus barrel per day oil export pipeline for heavy crude oil stretching from Alberta to the Maritimes. And this pipeline would have a dual purpose, of course, supply security in Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes, but also security of oil demand in Alberta. So in my mind, the first option is likely economic, meaning the one that is only meant to provide security of oil supply in Ontario. It would be very expensive and likely to be largely unused due to the higher attractiveness of alternate routes. The second is a project more similar to the canceled Energy East project. So we can talk a little bit more about Energy East and the problems with that project.
Yeah, curious to hear how that would work. But the Trans Mountain Pipeline, it did set a bit of a precedent. You know, we saw Indigenous land rights issues, we saw court issues, and it was time and environmental protests. How challenging was it, first of all, to get Trans Mountain built and up and running? And like, what kind of timeline did it take? How much money did it cost?
Well, the Trans Mountain Pipeline it went significantly over budget. I believe that the original plan for the pipeline, back when it was owned by Kinder Morgan, was meant to be around $3.7 billion. But after it was acquired by the federal government, then the cost of it did balloon up to, I believe the latest number is around 34 billion Canadian dollars. So it went significantly over budget. But we have to keep in mind also that there were a huge number of lessons learned about modern ways to build pipelines under Canada's new constitutional system with Indigenous rights involved and more stringent environmental standards.
Okay, let's talk about the Energy East line. What do you see there as a possibility?
Well, in my view, the Energy East pipeline, which was canceled in 2017, is very difficult to revive in 2025. And this is for 3 reasons. First of all, the company which owns the pipeline's route, TC Energy. So this route is the Trans-Canada pipeline. This was built back in 1951. But TC Energy has moved away from the liquids pipeline business in order to concentrate more on their gas pipelines. So these are the Trans-Canada pipeline is a natural gas pipeline from Alberta to Ontario. There are also major political challenges to building a new big oil pipeline across the country. And this includes, of course, the issue with the government of Quebec, whether you have social license to build a major pipeline in Quebec, as well as the question of engagement with Indigenous communities. And lastly, and very importantly, we need to note that an eastern pipeline route would likely be at its base uncompetitive compared to alternate export routes, including the incumbent Enbridge Mainline, and Line 5 is part of the Enbridge Mainline system, and the Trans Mountain Pipeline, like you said before. So an Energy East pipeline, a new one, would need to compete with those.
You know, part of the reason we need these pipelines is because our heavy crude gets sent down south of the border. They then refine it, and then the selling happens. Rather than go through the time and the expense and the hassle potentially of trying to build a pipeline that runs across the country, would it be more feasible to build more refineries? And so we are refining our own heavy crude.
Canada does import some refined products from the United States, but for the most part, Ontario still refines most of its own final fuels. So there's a large refinery complex in Sarnia. That's the place where much of this Canadian oil, which dips down to the United States and comes back into Canada, that's where this Albertan oil goes, is to these refineries in Sarnia and then also throughout southern Ontario. So for the most part, in terms of refinery capacity, as long as we're able to get enough Albertan, mostly light crude oil to these refineries, then that will underwrite most of Ontario's oil supply security. So it's not just a refinery situation. It's more, in my opinion, about the question of the Line 5 pipeline and whether that's vulnerable to disruption.
Donald Trump's America First policies have forced us really to sort of take our own Canada First stance on this. So would an East-West pipeline boost our economy? Like, what would it do for us financially to be able to have that line that runs across the country, potentially?
Well, it depends on many factors. Of course, the largest one is the economics of moving oil on this pipeline. Let's say that the pipeline is competitive with other export routes, and it would increase Canadian oil export by about 1 million barrels per day. I believe that there were some estimates put out by the Canada Energy Regulator about the economic impact on Canada from the opening of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, and that boosted Canadian GDP by, I believe it was 0.2%, and so that's a permanent boost. Let's just say that there's Albertan oil is still somewhat supply constrained, so we could anticipate similar effects if we see another 1 million barrels per day of oil export capacity come online.
Isn't it wild, Joe, that after years of talking about clean energy and the energy of the future, you and I are having a full discussion again about fossil fuels and how to expand that industry? Wild times. Joe Calnan, energy security analyst at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Thanks for your time.